So this is the first of a wee series of 4 that we're going to do on encounters by the sea. Lots of the gospel stories about Jesus are about him being near the sea or on the sea or in a boat in the sea. And so we want to think about some of the people that he came into contact with around the sea. And next week we're going to think about Jesus encountering a man who was demon-possessed. And this kind of battle between good and evil. The week 3, we're thinking about 2 people who really needed an encounter with Jesus. One whose son was gravely ill, and another woman who had been ill for years and years and years. And Jesus met them both and dealt with their needs. And then in week 4, it's about Jesus encountering his disciples in the midst of a great storm. But today, I want to think about Jesus and this encounter with these first people that he called to be his disciples, that he called to follow him, and what that meant and what it means for us. The very first thing to notice is that in doing that, Jesus made himself stand out from the crowd. In those days, if you were a rabbi, if you were a teacher, people came to you to study. They came to you to learn, and you pontificated and taught and did all the stuff that rabbis and teachers do, and people came to you to learn. And if you were any good, you kind of had a school, and people, loads and loads of people came to study and to learn from you. But Jesus went and sought the people he was going to teach. He went and called them. Having spent time praying and speaking to his Father about it, he went and said, you follow me. And so he was totally different to the other teachers of his day. And so right from the beginning, it's important to recognize that when we're talking about faith and thinking about following God, we have to remember that God came first. God seeks us out. His word tells us that time and time and time again. God comes looking for people who are lost. Jesus said that I came to seek and to save those who were lost. He initiates faith. And when we respond, he gives us the faith to follow it through. God does it all. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we think, oh, it's all about me and about my decision. But actually, God started it. He instigated it. And he gives us what we need to see it through. Before we go much further, I want to tell you a story about a man called Danny Wallace. Don't know if any of you know that name. He's an author, and he does kind of slightly odd things, because I think he might be slightly odd. But one of the books, one of the things that he did, brilliant book if you ever get a hold of it, was he had a relative, an uncle, I think, who lived in Austria or Switzerland. Can't quite remember which, Switzerland, I think. And this uncle had wanted to start a commune for pacifists. And he got himself and his wife and somebody else who needed somewhere to live. And that was it. They only got the 3, and then the uncle died. So Danny Wallace thinks, I'm going to see if I can get more people than my crazy uncle. And so he went out onto the street with a poster that simply said, join me. Yes. And he put an advert in the Loot magazine. It's a classified adverts magazine. And he wrote in there, join me, send 1 passport-size photograph to, and he gave the address. Nothing else, that was all it said. And he waited to see what would happen. And guess what? People joined him. And then more and more people joined him. And then somebody said, well, okay, we've done this, now what? And he said, well, I don't know, I just wanted to see if anybody would join. I don't know what we're going to do. So people got a bit stroppy. You've asked us to join you, and you don't know what we're going to do. What's going on? How does this make sense? And I went, okay, well, I'll tell you what, we'll all meet up, and then we'll work out what we're going to do. So they had a meeting for the joinees, which is what you call them. And they decided that what they would do is on a Friday, they would do random acts of kindness. So they just went out and they were kind to people. That sounds brilliant. Random acts of kindness. And then they decided that actually it didn't really matter if it was a Friday. It could be any day. And they did amazing things. I was reading a story because I looked up their website because it's still going. But somebody had written into him saying, thank you so much for doing this. I had no idea about this until I got a call from Debenhams where my wedding list was. And they told me that I should add more things to it because some of your joinees had bought us gifts. People I didn't even know, and they had all signed up to my wedding list and bought me gifts. That was brilliant. So I thought I would see what they were about. And thanks very much. So they do these kind of daft things. But Wallace himself says this: it was a piece of whimsy, a silly half project, but thanks to a huge and diverse group of perfect strangers, it became something much bigger. I'm still trying to work out how. Somewhat to his surprise, it did grow. There are now over 12,000 joinees. This year they're raising funds to build a school in Africa. It's a daft story. It's a great book. It's a daft story. He went through all sorts of issues. His girlfriend left him because he was spending all his time trying to work out what to do with these joinees and who they were, and people were stalking him because initially he had given his own address, and there was a whole range of things that went on because he had started this project. It's kind of like faith, you know. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. There were a whole load of hassles and issues along the way, and yet there was something that people perceived to be valuable in it. I think people want somewhere to belong. They want to belong to something. People are looking for something deep and significant where they can learn what it is that they have to offer. People are looking for a sense of community, and they'll look anywhere for it. And you know what? Our reading today tells us that we have all of those things to offer. That's what Christ came to give. He came to give community. He came to offer significance. He came to offer meaning and purpose in life. He came bringing good news, the gospel. Unfortunately, through generations, what we have tended to do, and that's why these pictures are up there, is we have not offered the good life in all its fullness. What we've offered is come to an institution. Come and be part of the church. And we'll suck all of the life out of you. Or at least, sometimes that's how it seems. But Christ offers life in all its fullness. He offers us something deeply, deeply significant and worthwhile. So what does it mean to be called by Jesus? Are there different levels of call? Are some of us called just to live a normal Christian life, and others are called into something much more serious and significant and special and important? Well, this passage in Mark, it tells us something about that. It's about ordinary people, and there's no difference. The disciples were fishermen, they were tax collectors, they were a whole variety of different people, a whole variety of different professions, and they all received the same call: follow me. None of them were told, Peter, you're going to be the main guy. You're going to take this forward in years to come. Of course, eventually, that was kind of revealed. But right at the beginning, it was, no, just follow me. Come and follow me. And you'll find your place at the right time. So the first thing that Mark wants to say is this: Jesus' call is good news. It's good news. We read today that there's a need to repent and believe the good news. That's what Jesus said when he came. Repent and believe the good news. The Greek word for good news is euangelion. And it's a word that we get from it evangelism, evangelical, evangelistic, and so on. Euangelion. It means news that brings joy. That's where we get good news. It's good news. News that brings joy. It was a common word in Jesus' time. We tend to, when we talk about good news now, in Christian circles, we think of it in very sort of narrow terms of the gospel. But in those days, it wasn't used like that. There was no particular religious significance to it. It was simply this idea of good news. After the Battle of Marathon, the Greeks, the Greek herald ran the 26.3 miles back, allegedly. Whether he did or not remains to be seen, but that's where we get marathon from. And he ran back with the good news that the Greeks had won the Battle of Marathon and that they had defeated their enemies. And that the word for good news, he brought euangelion. He brought news that brings joy. It was really exciting. It was dynamic. It was something of real significance that influenced the lives of lots of people. There's a book about Augustus Caesar, and it starts off... here is the story, but here is the good news. Here is the euangelion of Augustus, the good news of his reign and his rule. So Mark is reminding us that this is good news. It's really significant. It influences and affects lots and lots of people. The reason is that it brings real joy, but that's not because of what we have to do. It's because it's about grace. It's about what God has already done. It's not just an invitation to live life in a certain way by a set of rules and regulations, to do these things and not do those things. Because actually, that's not particularly good news. What it is a reminder that there's a battle that has already been fought and won. And Jesus won it. And so we can experience grace, forgiveness, mercy, and joy. The second thing that Mark wants to say is that Jesus' call is fanatically radical. Now, verses 16 to 20, it says, he came and he called them and he said to them, follow me. And they left their work to follow him. They gave up what they knew. However, the reality is this wasn't the last time they went fishing. This wasn't the last time they saw their father. They still did those things. And so the call to follow Christ does not necessarily mean that we have to give up everything, including our family and our jobs and all the rest of it, and go off somewhere to do something entirely different. That's not what this is telling us. But what it does mean is that in responding to Jesus, we are willing to give him priority over everything in our lives. It means that we have to be willing to give him priority over our careers, our goals, our desires, our vocational pursuits, our resources. Jesus is saying that knowing him, that serving him and following him must be the supreme purpose of our life. And everything else has to be secondary to that one supreme purpose. Now, to me, that sounds like a commitment that is fanatically radical. We live in a culture where anything that is radical or anything fanatical is viewed with real suspicion. It's very negative to be thought of as a fanatic or a radical. So something that is both fanatical and radical isn't going to go down very well in today's culture. You know, we understand that the people who walk into marketplaces with bombs strapped to them, they are fanatics. We don't want to be associated with that. Being a fanatic nowadays is a bad thing. That is the perception. Most people don't want to be labelled in that way. And we certainly would not want to be thought of as fanatically Christian. Because, well, we know those people. And we don't really like them very much. They're the ones who seem to be, maybe even are, overbearing, condescending, self-righteous, judgmental, narrow-minded, abusive. And so you can see why nobody would want to be thought of like that. So what's the solution? Well, from the perspective of our culture, the answer is simply to tone it down a little. Just chill. You know, relax. Don't go too far. You don't want to go overboard with the whole faith thing. You know, yeah, if you choose to follow Jesus, well, that's okay for you. But you don't want to take it too far. It may be that, as you have grown in faith, you become more involved in the life of the church. You've given time to that. Your family, particularly if they are not people who have faith, they begin to ask questions, they're beginning to wonder. Maybe they've said to you that you're doing too much and wondered what's going on with you. Maybe they've kind of said you're becoming a bit radical. Maybe they've meant it in fun, but maybe actually they've meant it nevertheless. From the perspective of our culture, most Christians are on a spectrum. On the one side of the spectrum are the hypocrites, those who claim to be Christian but don't live in a way that society would understand to be Christian. On the other side are the crazies, the ones who just go completely berserk for the whole thing. They just put heart and soul and mind and everything into it. Well, you don't want to be over that side either. Where do you want to be? You want to be somewhere in the middle. Relax. Chill. Don't want to go overboard one way or the other. Society says that our faith should be part of a well-balanced life along with our family, our friends, our job, and our hobbies. But that's not what Jesus calls us to. He calls us to put following him in a position of priority over everything else. And if the reading from Mark is not enough to convince you of that, then you need to read Luke chapter 14, verses 25 and 26, which says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. All of a sudden, that doesn't sound very balanced. That actually sounds quite radical, quite fanatical. It doesn't sound like, don't get too involved with this Jesus stuff. Of course, he's not saying you've got to hate your parents and your family. What he's saying is that in comparison to the love that you have for me, the love that you have for them will seem like hatred. He's saying that we can't do that I'll follow you if thing that we sometimes do. I'll follow you if my career goes well. I'll follow you if my plans for my family work out. I'll follow you if I have enough money. I'll follow you if you cure my illness. I'll follow you if you answer my prayers in the way that I want and when I want. Jesus is saying that following him is not a means to an end. It is the end. That's what we're to be about. He's saying that he doesn't want our relationship to be utilitarian. It's not what we can get out of it. It's not a means to an end. And look who Jesus is speaking to when he's saying this. He says, if anyone will come after me. He's not addressing some elite group of Christians, the spiritual SAS folk. It's not like that. If anyone would follow me. And so he's calling everyone to be radical and fanatical in their pursuit of him. The thing is that those people that sometimes we would call radical and fanatical Christians are usually called that not because they've gone too far, but actually because they haven't gone far enough. They have a certain boldness about them. They're willing to confront people. They're willing to be argumentative to make their point. That they're willing to stand up and confront evil. But actually, they've forgotten that Jesus was also fanatical in other ways. He was fanatically humble. He was fanatically wise, gracious, sensitive, loving, and sacrificial. Fanatical followers of Jesus understand that he was prepared to die for them because he loved us enough. And so, radical followers of Jesus are consumed by love, even for those who oppose them. And lastly, Mark reminds us that Jesus' call is to a journey. It's not a once and for all event. He says, "Come and follow me." So responding to Jesus is not a one-time decision. Following Jesus is a journey. It's not always easy, and it can take us to places and circumstances that we would rather not go and we never expected to find ourselves in. Following Jesus is about obeying him, putting him first, and doing his will rather than ours. Of course, we don't know all of the twists and turns that our journey will take. But we do know that we have somebody who has promised to walk beside us as we take it, to help us, to lead us, to guide us, to support us, to strengthen us as we take it. He doesn't call us and then leave us to get on our own. No, he says, "I'll walk with you, and let's journey together." Today, Shona and her friend Hannah are going to take the next step on their journey of faith. That Shona's getting baptized this afternoon. That's an amazing thing. It's a great thing to do, and a real step of faith and commitment. So the question, I suppose, then is for the rest of us. What about us? Will we choose to follow him? To take that next step of faith, even though we have no idea where it will lead. No idea how it will turn out. But trust that the one who calls will walk with us.